What is the biggest danger now with the at least exchange of harsh words? A military conflict between the North and the U.S.?
Well, the biggest danger would obviously be a conflict between the United States and North Korea. And it seems to me the fundamental issue is one of war avoidance, not of steps that would take us on the path to war. I cannot tell you exactly what President Trump's motivation might have been to make these statements. I consider them very imprudent and inappropriate. And if there are real dangers and risks of war, these are kinds of discussions that should be held in private with relevant governments, not conveyed in presidential comments from his vacation retreat.
Okay, if Mr. Pollack, you do not want to reveal exactly what Mr. Trump said to us again, let me read some of those quotes which you at least consider as unpleasant. So one of those is, all the military solutions now are in place, loaded and locked. Secondly, is that maybe those threats are not even strong enough for the North Koreans. That's what he said. Also, even though there are different voices coming from the administration, Professor Oh, in South Korea, what do you think these exchange of rhetoric bombs, at least, would eventually lead to?
Well, in South Korea, everything is very calm and silent because we are having a last pitch of the summer vacation here, I think, in Seoul, at least. Well, what they're taking here in South Korea is probably a rhetoric that's gone too far. So I think there will be some reason coming back between all these parties involved so that in the end, peace will resettle on the peninsula. What's bothering us, though, is the absolute silence from the South Korean government itself, because they don't seem to be very concerned about this because they are spending more time dealing with other issues at the moment. So South Koreans as a people are confused, but we don't know what to do with it.
Okay, before I go to the Chinese guests, I want to come back to the both of you once again. To the South Korean guest, Professor Oh, does the South Korea know to a certain extent as to the military, missile, and nuclear preparedness of the North at this point?
Well, we're 100% sure. We're 100% sure that North Korea has something that can actually sway a lot of people's decisions on their favorite terms, including United States. Trump has probably two options to play with. One is to acknowledge North Korean missiles capabilities at least. Number two, use forces to quell down all the missile bases. But either one is very plausible to us, to many people, including South Koreans and also Chinese people and Japanese people here. So because this is very confusing to us, at least in the sense that Trump is not making himself very clear about this situation.
All right.
And this is a very blunt speech from the U.S. president, who himself seems very lost about all this.
Okay.
The only thing he's showing to us is the anger. That's all we get here.
Anger, but the military preparedness, that was also President Trump was talking about. And we also heard the latest news from the military, Mr. Pollack, that if the president gives the order, the military have no other options. Okay. So what is, according to you, Mr. Pollack, your understanding of the U.S. military preparedness? What exactly is it, if you could describe to a certain extent?
Sure. Sure. Oh, absolutely. The United States has planned for war in Korea ever since the last war ended. There's no news in that. The presumption of all of that has always been, if North Korea were to initiate another conflict, invasion of the South, or take other kinds of steps against South Korea or Japan, that the United States would respond. It has a full range of options to deal with that scenario. What President Trump, though, at least in his words, is raising something very, very different. He's talking, it has the flavor of what we call preventive war. In other words, a war that the United States would initiate on its own, independent of whether North Korea or anyone else was or was not doing. Now, the fact that he has uttered these words doesn't mean that the United States is about to do this. I see very little evidence of any kind of a mobilization of American forces that would enable this to undertake it. But again, words count, and my biggest concern is that there would be some horrific miscalculation in this situation.
I see.
To be very frank with you, Tianwei, in an ironic way, what Trump has said benefits the domestic agendas of both President Trump and of Kim Jong Un. It conveys a sense that we're threatened on either side, but it's not going to the brink, but it is very, very useful as a political device, frankly, both from the White House and from the leadership of the North.
Mr. Yang, you are a seasoned analyst, so let me ask you about this very specific one.
Well, please.
1994, U.S. threatened to bomb Yongbyon nuclear plant. At the time was under developing in North Korea. Eventually, then the administration gave up that option. And we don't know the reason. But now we heard the rhetoric coming back to a high tension. The rhetoric, I'm here emphasizing. How should we understand the rhetorics now compared to a possible action back in 1994 for the United States?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's an immediate danger of war at all now. But we are indeed facing a slowly growing danger of war triggered by the further tests and a military attack from the United States, backed by the South Korea on North Korea. And the reason just come from the case you mentioned in 1994. You said you don't know the reason, but I do know.
Go ahead.
And I working there in Washington, D.C. in 1994 when U.S.
In the Chinese embassy.
Yes, when U.S. determined to have the so-called surgery military strike on Yongbyon. But what the reason they give up? Simply because the then President Kim Jong Un strongly opposed the plan. So that case revealed the fact, say, without South Korea's endorsement or participation, there's no possibility for American unilateral military strike on South Korea. For example,
on North Korea, you mean?
On North Korea, yeah. In South Korea, ROK constitution covers the all peninsula as their sovereignty. So legally speaking, if any other country like the United States want to military strike that land, that means strike the land without South Korea. You can see it's an illegal meeting. So that is why when the then President Clinton determined to do that, and then they had to consult with the counterpart from Seoul.
All right. Professor Oh, wow, you got a lot of responsibility there. According to Mr. Yang here in China, South Korea, Seoul actually got the trigger for whether you have a war or not with North, between U.S. and North. What do you say?
I totally agree with Professor Yang because it is in the South's position to prevent any war from occurring on the peninsula, especially in the 21st century. We are expecting a peaceful resolution between the North and South for ages, really, since the beginning, since the end of the war, the first war. So I think it's in the President Moon's intention to stop all. It has all possible means he has to stop the war from occurring again, and I think he is very absolutely committed to that.
Mr. Pollack, do you agree with that the trigger is in the South Korea's hands? But on the other hand, you also heard arguments that South Korea, Japan, and some of the others in the region are worried that the U.S. is not going to sacrifice the city of Boston, the city of Chicago, the city of New York for an ally.
Well, I think what's important to note here is that senior U.S. officials are quietly trying to calm things down, both publicly and privately. I noted that overnight I read that General McMaster, the National Security Advisor, has been in discussion with the National Security Advisor in Seoul, and the United States has pledged full consultations on whatever steps it would undertake. But again, let me emphasize, I agree very much with Yang Xiyu, both about the stipulations in the South Korean Constitution, but also about the fact that we are not on the edge of war. If there is any benefit, and I use that term advisedly, to what has transpired over the last several days, it has been to underscore to everyone the extraordinary risks that are posed by this war of words and by the potential that it could go in horrific directions. I don't think people remotely grasp the kind of conflict we could see ourselves in. And when I say we, I mean all the involved countries. One way or another, this would not so much envelop Guam,
right.
It would envelop the entire Korean Peninsula. So let me emphasize, though, North Korea's statement doesn't surprise me at all. They make those kinds of statements all the time. What they emphasized is all of this was on the presumption that these are plans and that they will be presented to Kim Jong Un, and that would depend on what the United States does. So if the United States does not undertake any kind of major military actions, I don't expect the North to do that either. It would,
Just to
it
follow
would still
up,
remain
Mr.
a situation of deterrence without it being resolved.
Yeah,
without it being
just to
resolved.
follow up, there has been comments about, Mr. Pollack, it used to be the case that rhetoric is flying from one direction. At the time, the weaker North Korea. And now you see rhetorical bombs flying both directions, from Washington and Pyongyang toward one another. And it's escalating as days go by. And also, there are personal attacks we see in those rhetorics between President Trump and also the leader in North Korea. This is one part of the story. The other part of the story, people in the US also talk about, well, let's rethink what the North Koreans have been saying. They make a whole sentence. The first part is, if the United States goes against the North Korea with military threat, the North Korea would. That's the second part. So they argue US has failed to listen to the first part, only try to listen to the second part for now. All I'm asking is, understanding both sides of the stories, where the eventual story, Mr. Pollack, is going. In other words, how will Washington as a whole judge the direction of the wind?
Well, I think that President Trump's repeated comments have greatly aroused both the political forces in the United States, the media. It's relentless. Even for me, it's all the time that you get asked questions. There are deep concerns. But again, it's very striking to me. There's another person we haven't heard from over in recent days, and that's Kim Jong Un. He has had nothing to say. His commander of strategic rocket forces is the one who made that statement. So he's been quiet. Even President Trump, in his latest tweet just this morning, has said he hopes Kim Jong Un chooses a different path, which you could argue is not quite as threatening. But it gets back to the fundamentals here, Tianwei. As I'm sure Yang Xiyu would fully acknowledge, we're not in 1994 anymore. We are in a very, very different strategic environment, and where the risks, the capabilities are far greater than before. And that just, to me, underscores the absolute need for prudence and restraint on the part of all parties, lest we find ourselves in a conflict that I don't really believe anyone seeks.
Mr. Yang, since Mr. Pollack already called your name, you have to respond.
Well, I'm not meaning there's no the possibility of the war at all, but I do say if South Korea changed the current idea, then the danger of war is really going high. But now it's pretty low, simply because of the different thinking between Washington and Seoul, between President Trump and President Moon. So at this moment, I don't think the rhetorical bombs against each other will lead to inevitable an ended war. Yeah.
Let's think about this. If we cannot judge, at least given all the rhetorics, because they are not basis for real sound judgment, let's look at history. What happened in history that can help us to understand what's going on? The Cuban Missile Crisis, for example. Mr. Oh, you, as a history reader, must also know that, Professor Oh from South Korea. President Kennedy, at the time, gave the president of Russia a chance to make a different decision. In other words, he didn't squeeze all the way so that the other party could still have some options. And that's, according to many, why something like a war did not happen. Okay, here is the current situation. Of course, it's nuclear, it's different. But there is also some analogies that we can draw here. Can we draw the analogy? What kind of analogy can we draw? Will the Trump administration draw the analogy? And will the North Korea, like then Russia, I mean at the time USSR, make a different choice? Professor Oh.
Well, back then in 1994, there was a KEDO solution for the whole situation in North Korea. Back then in Cuba in 1962, they had the same solution. That is, they could still talk through the hotline. Here we have everything. In the south, in the north, we have hotline. We have KEDO possible six-party talks. Well, all the options other than military direct military attack on North Korea. So here, as long as North Korea doesn't provoke any missile attack around Guam, as President Trump is asking, as long as President Trump considers possible, talks again between the United States and North Korea, I think there will be still solutions and the possible analogies of not provoking any war, hot war using nuclear missiles. So the human beings in the history have avoided actual nuclear confrontations between powerful countries. And I think we have all the capability to do so again, as long as we believe it.
Well, really? Is that going to be the case? Okay, there is likely to be a strike according to North Korean side, mid-August. Of course, you could say there are preconditions. On the other hand, the North Koreans are likely to launch another missile, possibly ICBM as well, and further doing nuclear tests if no negotiation is really underway. So we're likely to see these hyper tensions one by one ever more closer to one another. Mr. Pollack, very briefly from you.
Yes, no, I think you've brought us back to the other issues that if North Korea's continued development persists, that's the reality, exactly. This is where statements that say, I mean, Trump has not been specific, actually, about what, other than saying he doesn't want any more threats from North Korea. That gives him what we might call wiggle room. But I don't think in any way it minimizes the dangers and the risks that are here. The United States is about to undertake August exercises with the ROK, and those exercises generally trigger sharp words and sometimes actions from North Korea. So this will be a crisis-laden, potentially crisis-laden month, which calls for extremely prudent judgment on the part of all parties involved.
All right. Before we go, one sentence, and one sentence only, gentlemen, from every one of you. What's likely to happen with these rhetoric bombs flying around us every day, many times every day? Professor Oh Ingyu, one sentence.
Well, we can rebuke all the security problems right now and hope for peace soon.
Mr. Jonathan Pollack.
I do not see us on the edge of conflict. I also do not see us on the edge of negotiation. Maybe discussion, but certainly not a real negotiation. The differences are too intractable.
Mr. Yang, last but not least.
Certainly, there's a further tests, either nuclear or missile, but certainly no missile attack surrounding Guam at all. And the tension will last without exit for a while.